Hello, and I hope all is well. My name is Glenisha Runyon, and I'll be giving an integrative analysis of the comic book Yummy, The Last Days of the SouthSide Shorty. Robert Sandifer, nicknamed Yummy for his love of sweets, was an 11-year-old boy from the south side of Chicago. Interestingly enough, I'm from the south side of Chicago. This fact is one of the main reasons I chose this comic book for my analysis. That and the fact that I vaguely remember hearing about the story of Yummy when I was younger. Hailing from the Roseland neighborhood, he was a victim of the youth gang violence that was so prevalent in the 90s. During the summer of 1994, in an attempt to take out a rival gang member, Yummy shot and killed Siobhan Dean and left another boy with a spinal cord injury. A 3-day manhunt, or child hunt, led to the police finding 11-year-old Robert Sandifer dead under a viaduct just a few blocks away from his victim's death. He had been shot in the back of the head twice by the very gang members he so loyally kept his allegiance to. Yummy became the poster child for youth gang violence. His story was covered by news outlets across the country, leading to his infamous Time magazine cover. Politicians, news reporters, lawyers, and child specialists all had information and opinions to add to Yummy's tragic story and Chicago's rise in gang violence. Yummy's story gained conversation among celebrities and public figures as well. Here's a caption from a 1995 prison interview of Tupac Shakur speaking on Yummy and the topic of youth gang violence. Author G. Neary created a detailed adaptation of Robert Sandifer's tragic and publicized story using public records, personal accounts, and media reports. Illustrated by Randy Duberk, Yummy, The Last Days of a SouthSide Shorty communicates themes of social issues in a unique style catered to the story's narrative. Neary creates a fictional narrator to better guide the reader through the story and the different perspectives on Yummy's life. An integration of literary and visual disciplines creates an adaptation of Robert Yummy Sandifer's short life, leaving the reader with the question of whether Yummy was a victim or a little killer, as the media labeled him to be. Visual literacy creates a description of a complex narrative using visual disciplines to further comprehend the story being told. In this case, many visual techniques are used to convey Yummy's complex story. Most notable of the techniques is the use of black and white illustrations. This color scheme enhances the mood, and the change in volume between the black and white can intensify the tone being set. Furthermore, the use of contour lines amplifies the change between Yummy's childish identity and the gang member he claimed to be. In the top spread, the contour lines around his eyes darken as Roger narrates the change in Yummy's character from childlike to malicious. Equally important, according to comic theorist Scott McCloud, closure styles allow us to connect moments in comic books and mentally construct a continuous, unrefined reality. In Yummy, a scene-to-scene closure style is used to transition between changes in setting and time to convey the full story of Robert Sandifer. With the help of our narrator, Roger, the reader is taken through the details of Yummy's younger life and after his death, using the scene-to-scene transition. Correspondingly, visual tools such as politics and montage are used to aid the visual adaptation and the telling of Yummy's stories. The use of politic panels, shown in the bottom panels on the slide, depict the scenes where the members are hiding Yummy around the south side, create a sense of motion and fast pace that match the mood of the situation. Furthermore, there are many other usages of politic throughout this narrative. A particularly significant example of politic is shown in the top panels. The scene depicts how Yummy is found after his own gang members execute him. The use of this visual technique to convey this scene emphasizes the tragedy of the situation that has once again plagued the Roseland neighborhood. Similarly, the use of montage to change perspective is used throughout the comic. The reader first sees a narrated montage of Chicago's cultural history, highlighting all of the glamorous and notable aspects of the Windy City, before pulling the reader into the harsh reality of certain neighborhoods within the city. The next montage is seen as Roger narrates the different media outlets that gave their opinion on Yummy. The use of montage allowed the reader to view different perspectives individuals had on who Yummy was as a person. A literature review on graphic novels in the age of transition theorized that a good adaptation should have two components. One, the adaptation should be faithful to the original story rather than a retelling. And two, the adaptation should have a unique style suited for the original narrative. G. Neary's adaptation of Yummy's story uses a fusion of literary disciplines, starting with the use of an additive comic element where words and image amplify or elaborate on one another to produce deeper meaning. Most of the spreads use panels with illustrations showing actions, with the following panels adding text to elaborate on the scene. The synergy between word and image allow for a little more reader involvement and an amplification of individual comprehension. Important to realize is the use of a limited narrator as a literary element in order to more easily communicate the narrative. Roger, a fictional character in the real story of Yummy, acts as a reader's guide through Neary's adaptation. Roger communicates the different aspects of neighborhood people, media outlets, lawyers, child psychologists, and public figures, all giving opinions on Yummy's history and his tragic demise. Although Yummy's actions were that of a grown man, he was still a child in the end. Our limited narrator highlights the boyish ways of Yummy in the flashback of Yummy's days in the juvenile detention center and the scene depicting the older boys teasing Yummy for carrying around a teddy bear. Furthermore, in Yummy's final hour after the 3-day manhunt or child hunt, he displayed the childlike innocence of wanting a maternal caregiver when an issue feels like you can't handle it, as seen in the top right panel. Yummy is making a phone call to his grandmother looking for solace. Additionally, the use of foreshadowing is seen once in this narrative, but significant enough to note. Fictional characters Roger and his brother Gary, who is a member of Yummy's gang, discuss Yummy and the situation. During their conversation, Gary compares Yummy to a pit bull, insinuating that he was as obedient as a puppy, eager for approval. But when the puppy gets bigger, that's when you have to watch out. Knowing the story of Yummy and how his life ends makes the significance of what Gary said glaringly clear. Comparatively, G. Neary uses the literary tool of exposition to give a background of the critical elements in Yummy's story. Instead of gradually telling Yummy's story, the reader is given the plot in a 2-page spread, then later given details of the narrative to support the exposition. Important to note in the characterization and identity of Robert Yummy Sandifer are the 4 perspectives of identity developed by James Paul G. The first perspective argues that who you are is determined by nature, but that argument has evolved over time into perspective 2, which is you are who you are as determined by our placement in society. Perspective 3 suggests that we are who we are largely based on our individual achievement and skills as they are recognized by others. Lastly, perspective 4 is the idea that we are who we are because of the experiences we have had with our certain affinity groups. Yummy's characterization examines all 4 perspectives on identity. Furthermore, the issues of social justice communicated in this comic book contributes to the perspectives on Yummy's identity. Graphic novels offer the reader control over the speed of perception and the ability to linger or look backwards at will. The integration of different visual and literary techniques allow for an amplified reader experience. Comic books use text and image woven together to create a story neither could communicate on their own. This integrative technique can be used to create stories with the purpose of drawing attention to different themes and issues. Yummy, The Last Days of a SouthSide Shorty, conveys issues of social justice that are still prevalent in our society today. Youth gang violence, parental abandonment, and racial stigmatism are among the issues of social justice communicated in the narrative. Gang violence has been a leading issue of social justice in Chicago for decades. Even so, during the 1990s, Chicago experienced a surge in youth gang activity. The killing of Siobhan Dean and Robert Yummy Sandifer were just two of the 930 homicides Chicago saw in 1994. Siobhan, a victim of gang rivalry, and Yummy, a victim of youth gang violence. On the previous slide, the four perspectives of identity were introduced in relation to the issue of social justice presented in the narrative of Yummy. Yummy's influences and affiliation with the Black disciples examines the issue of youth gang violence, and the fourth identity perspective stating we are who we are because of the experiences we have with certain affinity groups. Yummy's affinity group was unfortunately a gang in which deeply influenced a part of who Yummy was and led to his unfortunate death. Gangs began recruiting children because they wouldn't be convicted of a felony regardless of the crime. Yummy was no different in doing the dirty work for his gang and being used as a little disposable soldier. Furthermore, and probably a major influence in Yummy's life, is the issue of parental abandonment. Yummy's father was incarcerated on drug charges, and his mother had been in and out of jail for drugs and prostitution. Yummy's parents' history with criminal offenses examines the first perspective on identity, that we are who we are as determined by nature. One could argue that Yummy's decision and impulsive actions could have been a genetic inheritance. Regardless, the lack of parental presence in Yummy's life can create abandonment issues in an impressionable child's mind. The theme of racial stigmatism is an underlying issue of social justice within this comic book. Most people immediately labeled Yummy as a little killer, a murderer, or a thug. Some took into account his lack of parental guidance and the influence of the society he was exposed to, but ultimately, the majority of the public eye viewed Yummy with a second perspective on Yummy's identity, that who you are is determined by our placement in society. Yummy was a young Black boy from a poor gang-riddled neighborhood. His placement in society was low on the totem pole, with a number of factors against him. Though this may be true, a primary reason for his low placement is his race. The racial hierarchy in America is no secret, but it is at a disadvantage to those who do not benefit. Envision if Yummy was white. He'd have America's sympathy just as Dylan Roof or any other number of school shooters beginning in the 1990s. He would be labeled as a lone wolf or misguided kid. Instead, he was labeled as evil and a little killer because of the aggression associated with Black men. To summarize, the themes of social injustice and the four perspectives on identity communicated in Yummy, The Last Days of a SouthSide Shorty, leaves the reader with the question of whether Yummy was a victim of his influences or just a malicious child with cruel intent. The story of Robert Yummy Sandifer is tragic, but all too common. The issue of youth gang violence continued to rise even after Yummy's publicized story, and unfortunately, the issue of gang violence is still prevalent in Chicago today. Nevertheless, G. Neary and Randy Duberg communicate and bring awareness to the influence of gang activity plaguing communities while retelling the last days of a SouthSide Shorty.